Good afternoon. Well, thank you very much for joining us in this afternoon, and thank you, Celia, for organizing this panel. So today I have the big honor of introducing somebody that doesn't need an introduction. So Rick Doblin, Ph.D., as you know, is the founder and president of MAPS, that is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. His professional goal is to help to develop legal contexts for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and other psychoactive substances, primarily as prescription medicines, but also for personal growth, for otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become legally licensed psychedelic therapist. He has been working in this for already over 4 decades. Yeah. Woo! For many of us, Rick is the lead. It's an inspiration. It's an inspiration for academics, for clinicians, and he has to do a lot of work, again, for a long time to make sure that all this could happen. So thank you, Rick, for joining us today. He will present MDMA-Assisted therapy, will give us a MAPS update, and tell us about the future directions. Rick, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a relief to be in a civilized country where the king is only ceremonial. I think what's happening in America is worse than Brexit right now. I won't dwell on it that much. I just wanted to apologize to the extent I can for what's going on in America. We're going to continue to try to change it back to democracy if we can. So today, though, I'm going to speak to you as the founder of MAPS from 1986. We had started a public benefit pharmaceutical company in 2014, which was the MAPS Public Benefit Corp. It's now Lykos. And so I'm speaking to you as the president of MAPS. I'm not representing Lykos. A couple things about why psychedelics are so important. E.O. Wilson, the real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions with medieval institutions and godlike technology. And this was apparent to me back in 1972 when I tried to focus my life on psychedelics, when it was clear that we had technologies that we were developing that were brilliant, but we don't have really the emotional or spiritual capability to deal with them. And I felt that that's where psychedelics could sort of bring us into balance. I recently came across this quote from the founder of one of the most important environmental groups. And he said, "I used to think the top global environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of global science, we could address these problems. But I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." And so I think this idea of consciousness change, both for individuals and then collectively as groups, is something that's really going to be instrumental in whether humanity really has a good future. And we see now massive projection on the part of Trump and this idea of the shadow. And so what Carl Jung has talked about is the best political, social, and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. And I think that that's where, if there's a bright side at all to what's going on in America, we could say that the shadow is so visible, it's so clear, we can at least grapple with it as it really is, as in the whole massive selfishness. So this is the logo of MAPS as developed by Alex Gray. And the important part of the logo is that the hands are in front of the psychedelic swirl. So the meaning of this is that what we're talking about is really therapy. It's the therapeutic intervention, it's creating a safe space. I really enjoyed this prior conversation about the role of the dyad with two therapists. But this really tries to avoid, I think, what's happening now with the for-profit psychedelic companies is this trend, which is very unfortunate, to really separate the drug from the therapy and to become traditional drug companies, traditional pharmaceutical companies, when really the operating principle that makes the most difference is the therapy itself. Yeah. It's just when you pave a new way, and it's kind of not really the traditional way, it's really difficult, and you have to have people that are willing to do that. And then once you get in investors and they're thinking about the return, it turns into, right now, people are looking at what's going on with esketamine, with Johnson & Johnson, and it's considered a massive success. It's turned into $1 billion more per year annual sales, and is projected to grow up to $2 billion, and this is esketamine without therapy. So people look at it from a business perspective and say, oh, this is great, let's just continue and use this model. And we also have the problem where we don't have reimbursement for mental health for therapists as much as we do for drugs. So the drug path reimbursement is easy. So these are the challenges. And what MAPS is about is both advancing research, changing policy, and shaping culture. And we can say that both science and politics are downstream from culture. So the real work that was done over the last 40 years or so to try to change culture, to create the context where this therapy is really permitted, and the research is back into the researchers are back in the laboratories. It's really this cultural change, and that's why MAPS has had sort of a parallel path, two parallel paths. The first has been drug policy reform, trying to make it so that people have access. The second is drug development through the FDA. And what we see is that medicalization creates the context, creates the information, and changes attitudes towards drug policy reform. So we need to really move in both parallel tracks, because when we think about, we want to make psychedelics available for people with diagnosable disorders covered by insurance, but we think the cultural change that we're talking about is really going to come about from millions, tens of millions of people over time having more profound interconnected experiences, working through their traumas, and that's probably going to come much more likely from legal access to the extent we can do that. I'm aware that here in England, marijuana is still not legal. It's not federally legal in the US, but just to show how this kind of culture and research go together, we've just recently at MAPS have won this formal dispute resolution request with the FDA, and it's about a cannabis project. So we have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan. This was friends of ours put in the initiative to legalize cannabis in Michigan, that the government had to spend $20 million a year for 2 years to do FDA-regulated research to help veterans with PTSD and other mental illnesses. And so we've got $12.9 million. And for years, the FDA was refusing to let us study smoked marijuana, refusing to let us study vaporized marijuana, and refusing to let us do what we call self-titration, which is where patients adjust their dose and decide how much or how little they want to use per day and when they want to use it, instead of the traditional way of giving people the same amount at the same time. Everybody has to do that. So one of the main advantages of cannabis is that you can use it and people can adjust their own doses. You get rapid feedback. So this idea of self-titration is really important. And I should say that cannabis for PTSD is palliative, not curative. It's not our preferred approach. We want to help people get to the root cause, not to give them just access to a drug that they use to control symptoms and use every day. But there are tens and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands probably, people in the U.S. using cannabis for PTSD, and none of it is covered by insurance. So if we're able to go through the FDA, then we can get it covered by insurance, and also we can find out which kinds of people it works for. So we hired really good lawyer scientists, and we won this formal dispute with FDA. And so now we can study vaporization, we can study smoking, we can have patient self-titration. And this was just an article in the New York Times, Weed for PTSD, Eager for Better Cannabis Science, FDA Clears Study. It kind of gives the FDA more credit than they deserve. You're like, the FDA clears the study because they're eager. It was only through legal action that they became eager. And then we have Psychedelic Science 2025 coming up. I'd like to invite all of you to come. We're having a bit of a challenge in that a lot of people don't want to come to America anymore at this particular time. And so we are going to live stream some of the main panels so that people will be able to access it if they don't want to come to America. So MAPS has been funded over the years with around $150 million worth of donations. And we've benefited from an enormous amount of volunteer labor, of people working under market, of people giving us connections to law firms, to all different groups. And so now that we have launched this public benefit for-profit company, MAPS is focusing now primarily on globalization of access, some research in the US, which I'll talk about, and then legalization and drug policy reform, while Lykos Therapeutics is now funded, well-funded, and will be focusing on FDA approval, and then we'll start moving presumably to England and some other places in Europe. So MAPS is the single largest shareholder in this, but we're a minority. We don't call the shots. And there's about to be another $100 million put into Lykos. So I think the message is that we will be able to achieve FDA approval. I'll tell you a bit more when I think that might be. But one of the things that has been recently disappointing in August was the FDA rejected MDMA, the Lykos New Drug Application. And before that was June 4th, was the FDA Advisory Committee recommending against it for reasons that I think were clouds of suspicion that were not really grounded, but were enough to cause confusion. And what people have not heard about as much, that was June 4th, where the FDA Advisory Committee said no, but June 6th is when the Dutch State Committee on MDMA, the equivalent, or in a sense, of the FDA Advisory Committee, except for the fact that they had real subject matter experts. And they spent a year looking at the data, and they had to publish a report justifying their findings, whereas the FDA Advisory Committee didn't have subject matter experts. They just spent a couple weeks looking at the data. They didn't have to justify anything. They just had to vote. And it was very difficult. And then this just came out 2 days later. If this would have come out 2 days before, it would have been a whole different story. But it came out 2 days later. And this was because in 2023, Lykos shut down all the research in Europe that we had going on. And the Dutch had seen a lot of great benefits. Eric Vermetten was the chief psychiatrist for the Dutch Ministry of Defense. And he ended up, and the Dutch government said, there's an unmet medical need. If Lykos is pulling out of this, that's where they decided to do this state committee. And it was really good to see their results. But August 9th, the FDA said no. I'm not going to talk about all the reasons. I'll just talk about one. But then in October, the Mental Health Committee of the Dutch Parliament endorsed the recommendations of the Dutch State Committee. So there will be movements forward in the Netherlands with MDMA research. But the one thing I want to talk about now, just since it was such a big issue for the FDA advisory committees, was this idea of functional unblinding. You know, as you know, if we were to give everybody here a pill and half was placebo and half was MDMA, you would probably be very accurate in guessing which you actually got. So it's very hard to blind psychedelic research. And so my dissertation, a lot of it was focused on how to do blinding studies with psychedelic therapies. And my solution was therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. And the goal was to find the dose that's high enough so it causes confusion with the full dose. So microdose doesn't work because you wouldn't notice it. Tiny doses probably wouldn't be much confusion. But then you didn't want a dose that's so high that you get such therapeutic potential that you can't tell the difference anyway. So in 16 years of phase 2 studies, we looked at therapy with no MDMA, therapy with 25 milligrams, 30, 40, 50, 75, 100, 125, and 150. And we would then have an optional supplemental dose of half this initial amount after 2 hours. to extend and make the session 8 hours long. So this was looking for this ideal dose to do the double blind in the way that I had sort of figured would be the best in my dissertation. As it turns out, and this is the beauty of research, is sometimes you find your theories are wrong. And I was half wrong, half right. So what we did show is that the low doses were somewhat effective in increasing the blind, but they made people uncomfortable. This is what we didn't anticipate. So that those people that got these low doses still got better, but the people that got therapy with no MDMA did better than the people that got therapy with 25, 30, 40, and 50 milligrams. And then we discovered, to my surprise, that the 75 milligram dose group was actually remarkably effective. So this crossover point where these low doses become sort of anxiety-provoking and still helpful, but not as much, and then it becomes very helpful. So we could not find a sweet spot of what would be the dose. And so we went to the FDA in this 8-month special protocol assessment process after we got permission to go to phase 3, and we said, we'll give you blinding, but you're going to make our job easier to find a difference between the groups than if we do therapy with inactive placebo. And so the FDA itself chose to make it harder for us therapy with inactive placebo, knowing that the double blind wasn't likely to be very effective. And they said there's 2 main ways to reduce experimental bias. The first is random assignment, and then the second is independent raters, blind to the condition, to evaluate the PTSD symptoms. So that's what we did. But then we made agreements with people at the FDA in 2018, and then they left the FDA, and new, more conservative people came in. And so you should not be making agreements with individuals, you should be making agreements with the organizations. But we then were confronting more conservative people at the FDA, and they made a bigger deal about this functional unblinding. But really, there was no good solution that we could find, and we really thought making it more difficult for us to find a difference between 2 groups was the better way to go. So with that failure, now what's happened is that we've needed to bring in new investors. So one of them is Antonio Gracias, and he will be assuming sort of operational control of Lykos. And then the other is Sir Christopher Hahn, who I met with last night, who is a philanthropist, hedge fund person from England. And so the 2 of them are sort of coming in together to take on operational control over Lykos. So there's the proverbial fork in the road. You may have heard about Elon Musk's fork in the road email. But there's, as far as I can tell, there's sort of 2 ways that things could go. The FDA, when they rejected the new drug application, they said that, and Lykos put out a press release saying that they wanted another phase 3 study. It's not clear to me that another phase 3 study is really needed, because I believe that our data is solid and is good, and there will be review of all that data. So what is possible is that in the next 6 months or so, once the new team takes fully control over Lykos and starts negotiating with FDA, that FDA could potentially say, you don't need another phase 3 study, we're going to approve the drug, and you will need what's called phase 4 study. That would be for additional safety data, durability data, things like that. Or the FDA could say, we do want another phase 3 study, and that could mean approval in 3.5 years, something like that. So these are the 2 main ways that it could go. I'm not directly negotiating with FDA, so it's not clear which is more likely. But the hope is that with the new administration, which is remarkably sympathetic to psychedelics, that there may be this more reasonable review of the data. So what MAPS is doing now is going around the world to do trainings in sort of not only, but mainly high trauma, low resource areas. We've done trainings in Australia, in Sarajevo, in Iceland, in Israel. And we've got one coming up in Ukraine, so I'm leaving in a couple weeks to go to Ukraine. We're training Ukrainian therapists in a safe city in the western part of Ukraine. We've had over 200 Ukrainian therapists and psychiatrists apply for 55 spots in this particular training. And so then we're going to try to take more of them to Poland. The women can more easily leave the country. Then we're going to train Israelis and Palestinians in Israel in September and in Mexico in early next year. So one of the key parts about training is, and this is, I think, a big frontier, is this idea of therapist self-experience. You know, you wouldn't go to an ayahuasca shaman that's never done ayahuasca. Why is it controversial that therapists who want to work with psychedelics could learn more if they have their own experience? It shouldn't be controversial, but a lot of psychiatrists say, I give ECT to my electroconvulsive therapy to my patients. I don't need to give it to myself. You know, I give antipsychotics to my patients. I don't need to take it myself. And all that's true. But what we know is in psychedelic therapy, the main ingredient in the therapy is not the drug, it's the therapist. And so the therapist is part of the treatment. So we did get FDA approval for a protocol to give MDMA to therapists, and over 107, or about 107 people went through it and felt really strongly how valuable it was. We got a second protocol approved, but Lykos decided not to implement it. It was expensive, and they didn't want to somehow make this seem like it would never be a requirement. It's always optional. Whether therapists have their own experience, never required, but strongly recommended. And you can be a good therapist who's never done MDMA, and you can get better results than somebody who's not as good a therapist who's never done MDMA. So it's not to say that everybody has to do it. It's just people will learn a lot about it. And when you do any other kind of therapy, normally you go through the therapy. But since it doesn't involve a drug, there doesn't have to be a protocol to do that. We've started research in Somaliland. And the very first way that we wanted to do, because they don't have a psychedelic culture in the same way, is we got approval for a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And so this was really, really helpful to them. And now we've got another similar protocol in Canada, in Vancouver, and this was Mark Hayden. This has just been approved by Health Canada and also by the IRB, the Ethics Committee. The challenge is that you cannot pay to be in a protocol, so this would have to be funded by philanthropy. So we're looking at that. But when we talk about access, and then we talk about really equitable access, one of the key drivers of that is going to be group therapy. And how do we move from individual to group therapy? What can we learn about it? Some people really will benefit mostly from individual, but group therapy, we started at the Portland, Oregon VA. And this was groups of 6 with 4 therapists. And this was in an individual session first, and then later a group therapy session. And so after the first 2 cohorts, 12 people went through it, they all felt that they wanted a third MDMA session. So the protocol was changed. And so now it's an individual session and then 2 group therapy sessions. In Israel, this particular project was with highly traumatized people who are combat veterans, and this was a little bit different. So this was 2 individual sessions and then a group session. And again, similar model of 4 therapists, 2 main therapists, 2 assistants, and 6 people. The Israeli Ministry of Health, this is tremendous. This is going to be the biggest study ever comparing directly individual therapy versus group therapy. And this will be groups of 7 with 2 therapists, 2 assistants, and groups of 7. And this is now going to be starting up very, very soon. We're hoping to raise money for this project with Jilly Norton supporting wounded veterans. This would be at King's College, 2 therapists for 3, so just a group of 3. And then in Australia, this is the first project for climate-related PTSD. So this is from floods, and this is funded by the Australian government, and this will be, again, groups of 6 with 4 therapists. So one of the other things that's really a frontier that's going to be sort of crosses this line a little bit between drug development and drug legalization is couples therapy. So couples therapy, it's not a diagnosable disorder. FDA has never approved a drug unless it was for depression, anxiety, addiction, PTSD, something like that. But theoretically, there's nothing blocking them from that. So we could potentially get approval for couples therapy. So the first approach was this cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. And this is really a treatment for PTSD, where one person has PTSD and you bring their partner into the treatment. And we did this experiment with 6 dyads, and both of them got MDMA, and the results were better than anything they got, both in reduction of PTSD and strength of the relationship. And then this was done at a place called Sunstone in Rockville, Maryland, and this was for cancer patients who were anxious about dying, who had this adjustment disorder, and it would bring the cancer patient and the partner, and both would get MDMA. And this was also tremendously successful. And now we're starting this project to interview underground MDMA therapists all over the world who do couples therapy, and to learn how they do it, what are their methods, and then we will then use this to develop a protocol, probably in San Diego, to formally study in an academic way MDMA-assisted therapy for couples. Now, in terms of social change and things that are moving forward, this is about the most remarkable new development, is that the Department of Defense has put in $10 million to give MDMA-assisted therapy to active duty soldiers. It's one thing to work with veterans, but when you start getting into the military, it's even more sort of mainstream and accepted. And the other idea of this is really that we want to work with people closer to the trauma, not just when it's fully developed into PTSD, but closer to the trauma. So this is going to be at Walter Reed, $4.9 million. And there's another one that's going to be combining MDMA with prolonged exposure at Emory University and also in Texas. So there's a lot of hope, a lot of things are moving forward, and I'm now focusing as much as I can on this globalization. And so the concept is a world of net zero trauma by 2070. As I said, I think we are going to obtain FDA approval in the US, it'll spread, but what's the next big vision is cultural change on humanity as a whole. Net zero trauma doesn't mean no trauma. It just means that we're not adding to the burden of trauma. 2 different kinds. One is epigenetic, multi-generational trauma passed on through epigenetic mechanisms. The other is trauma that people experience in their life. So it's likely to get worse in the world, bad news, but by 2050, if we don't do more in climate change, which we're not doing right now, there's estimate there could be over 1 billion climate refugees in the world, which will completely destabilize cultures, countries, and people. And so we do have a project in Somaliland, as I mentioned, where we've trained some therapists. Now it's going to be administered to a small group, and then it'll go up to like 100 people. MDMA is coming from Canada. In Denmark, we're trying to raise money for a project, therapists that we've already trained, Syrian refugees. In Denmark, 2nd generation. In Rwanda, we've had some planning meetings. They're ready to work. The thing that's going to be really interesting about this globalization work is that in Rwanda and other places, there's not a lot of therapists or psychiatrists. So it'll both be groups and also local healers. Could be nurses, could be others. We'll have to identify who are going to be the providers. We've got also trained therapists ready to do this project with survivors of the Srebrenica genocide. Women survivors it's been forever to try to do this, but we finally have a project in Palestine with Palestinian therapists with Palestinian PTSD patients. Again, it's going to be waiting on funding. In Lebanon, I'll be going to Lebanon after I go to Ukraine in May to speak about bringing MDMA-assisted therapy, and we have funders for that if we can get the political support. You'll hear more about this work from Lior and others, but there's a project that we're working on. We just started with ICEERS to think about metrics and how to methodologically think about MDMA-assisted peace circles with Israelis and Palestinians. So it's sort of like couples therapy, but communities in conflict. In Ukraine, they're changing the law. Ukraine was left with terrible laws from Russia where you could not do research with Schedule I drugs. It had to be a medicine somewhere else. So finally, the Ukrainian government has put out draft regulations just a couple weeks ago to change the law. So after we do the training, we're likely to be able to get permission to do actual research there. And so our goal is prioritizing global communities with the largest burden of trauma and the fewest resources for treatment. That'll be the MAPS mission. and that will be carried on, we hope, over the next decades towards this net zero trauma. And so I'd just like to invite you again to our Psychedelic Science Conference, and I look forward to the panel and to more discussions with all of you. Thank you.